Good evening. Welcome to our December 14th, 2021 Finance Committee meeting. We'll have a call to order. We'll do introductions. Jim, would you go first?
Jim Lothridge.
Diane Potter.
Becky Fless.
Nicole Medore.
Administrative staff.
Pat Hopkins, Superintendent.
Andrea Dish, Business Manager.
Thank you. First on the agenda is the 2022-2023 budget timeline in draft form.
Do you want to review it?
Sure. I wasn't planning to go through line by line.
Mhm.
Basically, it follows the same calendar that we do every year. I've crafted this with the expectation that this year we will have an annual meeting in our school budget referendum. For those of you who've been here, we have not had an annual meeting for the past 2 years because of the pandemic. But we are being hopeful that maybe things might return to some sort of normal. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that this is a fluid document and changes as needed. There are a lot more finance committee meetings in the month of March. For those of you who have been here, you know that we meet on a weekly basis. And sometimes things shift depending upon when the ED 279 is here or when the budget might be available. But for the purpose of creating a draft timeline, here it is.
And Andrea sent this to me probably a couple weeks ago to review, and I'm now reviewing it for the first time. And
Already
there's a
scratch out.
change. February 22nd, that should be February 15th. February 22nd is during February vacation week.
Correct.
I know I will not be in town.
So we can make that, I will make that change on the calendar.
And so, Andrea, as I read through this, the state referendum or the local referendum this year will be on June 14th.
It usually is on the second Tuesday of, and they may not even be having a state referendum. Usually the clerks do not know until the spring whether there'll be a referendum. But if we find that there isn't going to be a state referendum, we may choose to move that date. So until we know more information or until we have more information, this is what I expect it will be.
Okay.
Perfect. Great.
And what is that, the second Tuesday of June?
Yes, that is usually, if the state holds a referendum, that's typically when they hold it, but sometimes they wait until the last minute to make decisions whether or not there'll be a state referendum. And usually we tag along with them because the municipalities have to hold a state for referendum and they have to pay clerks and whatnot. If we hold our own referendum, we pay the entire cost. So it makes sense not to do it on our own, but to piggyback on the states.
That's okay.
Glad you could make it.
So any questions about the budget timeline?
No, as Andrea said, just so you know, that February 22nd on the timeline has been changed to February 15th. So it's in.
But you'll
paperwork.
receive this sheet of paper many times in the future.
Yeah,
So you
it's
don't need to worry
fluid.
about it.
It's fluid, but we
Yeah.
absolutely know the 22nd won't work. So right now it's the 15th. Okay.
So this is the budget timeline as we typically do it year after year. So it's just a handy thing that will change regularly. Next on the agenda is the ED 279.
So the last time that we were here, we didn't actually review the ED 279. I shared it with you because we were discussing what the implication was to our free and reduced rates going down. I have been asked to now review the entire ED 279 with you. Just keep in mind that this is last year's ED 279. And I just want to go through with members so that they have an understanding of how the state allocates subsidy to all of the school districts. This is their mechanism for trying to fund school districts equitably throughout the state. So We're going to have a go at it, and I'll explain questions I'll address questions as we go along. So here's the ED 279. The first page you will see, it says ED 2, well, they all do. The first page says section 1. So the state talks about two kinds of pupil counts. There's attending counts, and the other count that they talk about is subsidizable pupil counts. So in the first part of this calculation, they use what's called attending, which is all students attending the school districts, attending our school district, which includes tuition kids, in addition to kids who are residents of the district. So every year, actually twice a year, actually we're back to once, Terry, right? Are we still doing a April count? So the state requires us to take account of our students twice a year. For the purpose of the ED 279, they use the October count. So on October 1st of every year, every student takes a seat in the school district where they're at. And we count all of our kids. We actually count them all in a lot of different ways. We count special ed kids, we count ELL kids. There's just a lot of different counts. So the state in section 1A breaks these counts out by pre-K to K, 1 to 5, 6 to 8, and then it regroups them pre-K to 8 and 9 to 12. Pre-K to 8 is considered elementary and 9 to 12 is considered secondary. So basically what in section 1, what it does is it takes a 2-year average of our attending counts for this year, which was 2021. And well, on this year, remember, this is not this year's ED 279, it's last year's. We don't have this year's yet. So for last year, it would have been 2020 and 2019. So that's all section A cares about. In section B, they start to allocate funds based on the number of staff members. So I'm going to go through teachers all the way across so that you can understand. I am not going to go through 1 through 8, which is school admin, but I just want you to see how they do what they do. So for pre-K, in section B, on line 1 teachers, you see a student to staff ratio of 15 to 1. So what this line does is it takes the 212 pre-K to K students that we have above, and it divides it by 15. And according to the state, we should have 14.13 pre-K to K teachers for our district based on the number of students that we have. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? So for 16 and above, or for grades 1 to 5, the ratio is 16 to 1. For every 16 students, there is 1 teacher. So above, it takes the 1 to 5 2-year average, and it divides it by 16. So the state says that we should have 43.5. And it does this all the way across. 6 to 8, the student to staff ratio is 17 to 1. So it divides our 6 to 8 total of students by 17. And they say that we should have 25 staff members for grades 6 to 8. And for grades 9 to 12, the ratio divided, I can barely see, 39.84, I believe is what it says. So if you go across and you add up what they say for each of the grade levels, there's a total EPS FTE, which is full-time equivalent staff, of 122.48. According to them, based on the number of students that we have, this is the number of staff members, the number of teacher members that we should have. In actuality, we have 132 staff members. Do you see that in the next column over? So it's actually higher than what they're approving. So basically we get a percentage of EPS. So what they do is they figure out what percentage 122 is of 132, which is 0.98. In the background, they have a EPS matrix, which has salaries for teachers that they have created, not our salaries. They have placed all of our teachers in their salary matrix. And this is what they say is the equivalent of all of our salaries for the teachers that we have based on experience. So it's based on experience and it's based on track. So they say that all of our teachers in their matrix add up to 7,727,074. They're only going to give us 0.93% of that, which is the percentage of EPS. So you see the adjusted EPS subsidy. Do you see where I am of 7,169,643? In the next two columns, they're dividing that between elementary and secondary. And they know what elementary is because I just told you it's pre-K to 8 and 9 to 12 is secondary. So we're going to keep watching those columns over to the right that say elementary and secondary because there's a method to their madness. So what I just did, they do the same thing with guidance counselors, librarians, health, which is the nurses, ed techs, which is district ed techs. It does not include special ed techs, library ed techs, clerical, which is your school administrative assistants, and your school administrators, which is your principals and assistant principals. So throughout, they did the exact same exercise that we just did, and they plopped those figures in the elementary and the secondary columns. The next section is section, anybody have any, before I move on to section C, does anybody have any questions about section B? No. Jim.
We have chosen to add a lot to guidance this year.
Mm-hmm.
Have they adjusted any of that to accommodate for COVID, or is this just the same equation that they have done year after year after year?
So if you remember, we are looking at last year's ED 279, and they haven't shared with us this year's ED 279. The great news is that all of our positions that are being paid out of ESSER are not included or not held against us in this calculation. And most of those guidance counselors that we have added and some of those new teaching positions are paid out of ESSER.
Okay,
And for clarification, they're not guidance counselors, they're social workers that we've hired, additional social workers.
They add the social workers and the guidance counselors
Under the same
together,
line?
yes.
Okay.
So any other questions on B? So section C is the computation of benefits. This is a strict percentage. So I'm just going to, again, go through the first line. So you see teachers, guidance, librarians, and health, and you see percentages 19%. So if you added up the lines above for elementary for teachers, guidance, librarians, and health, that's out those salary lines from section 1, and you did 19%, that's the figure that you'd come up with. 5,311,542. I wish I brought my readers with me. And if you did the same thing for secondary for the same position, so they're just adding up teachers, guidance, librarian, and health, which is your nurses. Those salary figures to the right, and then doing the 19%. And they do this calculation for each of the positions above. And then they add those figures over to the right again. So you can see how those continue to add. Questions about section C? Section D, per pupil cost. This is where the state gives us a cost per pupil for the number of students that we have. So the first thing that you see is substitute teachers for half a day. For every pre-K to 8 student that we have, the state will give us $46. For every 9 to 11 student that we have, the state will give us the same $46. So I remember they're using the attending student counts from above, adding up not pre-K to 8, 9 to 12, and they're coming up with these calculations. Questions?
Yes. So that $46 is for each half day, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just a question about section C, the computation of benefits.
Sure.
Those percentages, that is, it's the cost of the benefits represented as a percentage of that individual's salary.
So the state is saying that they're going to give 19% of those salary, 19% of those salary figures. They're going to throw it in our bucket towards
Covering.
benefits. I'm not sure if that's what you said. That's
Probably not exactly, but that makes sense.
So they do the same with supplies and equipment. You'll notice that pre-K to 8 is $3.99 per student, and 9 to 12 is $5.52, $5.22. Excuse me if.
552.
Thank you. Professional development. I don't think I need to go through each of these unless somebody has a specific question about those in section D. Co-curricular and extracurricular, you'll see that pre-K, number 5, they give us $43 per student, and 9-12 is $132. And if you actually added up the cost of our curricular and co-curricular, that's not even a drop in the bucket. But so that is section D. Section E is the regional adjustment for staff and substitute salaries. So the state, in this calculation, the state looks at the state as a whole, and it looks where our highest salaries are, and it adjusts those school districts that do not live in those communities where the highest salary, or those regions where the highest salaries are. So as a result, we get a reduction to this calculation, or we get 0.95% of what we're adding up. So if you're looking at the sheet and you look at the elementary and the secondary lines to the far right, we are going to, or the state is going to add those two columns separately, elementary and secondary. So you will see where it has added everything, and then it's going to divide by the number of pre-K to 8 students, and you'll see that above, and the 9 to 12 students. And what you have there is the calculated EPS rate for K to 8 and 9 to 12, or pre-K to 8 to 9 and 9 to 12. So the whole purpose of the sheet, the first sheet, was to get that EPS per pupil rate for elementary and secondary. And once you have that, you can forget about everything else you've seen. On page 2, however, you will see where those two rates are used throughout. So this is where we actually start throwing money into that MSAD11 bucket. So on page 2 of the calculation, the state talks about subsidizable students. So subsidizable students are students the state will give us money for. Those are students who live in our 4 communities, and it also includes students where Pat has signed a superintendent transfer. So a superintendent transfer is a reciprocal agreement between the superintendents of 2 school districts to allow students to go back and forth, well, or to exchange school districts, to change school districts, I guess that's the best way. So like the attending pupil count, there's also a count taken in October for those as well. And the state in this calculation uses subsidizable as opposed to attending. So you see the same thing as you did from page 1, where the state looks at 2 years and it averages out subsidizable pupils over those 2 years. In section B, or in subsection B rather, you see basic counts. So the state looks at, or it starts to give us money. So unlike with all of the other counts, the state only uses, it doesn't use the 2-year average when doing pre-K. It only uses the most current, so which is why you see 4-year-olds. They're using the 63 count as opposed to the 2-year average. It then multiplies the number of students from last year by that elementary rate on page 1. And then it throws in $452,718 into our bucket. It does the same thing with K-8 students, except in this case, it uses the 2-year average. So you'll see from above the 1,257.5 students times that elementary rate from page 1 equals 9,036,395. So again, we're starting at the column to the right is the column that we care about. That is the money going in to our coffers. Adult education courses, which is number 4. Those are those adult ed students who are accessing classes, and that's from a report that Josh provides, and they give us some funds for that, or actually those secondary students who are accessing adult ed students, rather. I said it backwards. We, I don't even know what they did in 9 to 12, that's why. 5, 6, and 7 are those students who are homeschooled, who are accessing districts. So they may come in for a class, they may come in to take a history class. So those students are counted based on the number of classes or the percentage of the day that they're accessing. And we are given monies for those. So you can see, according to line 7 and subsection B, that we have 0.25 of a student who's accessing, a homeschool student who's accessing district services or district classes, and they've tossed in a little bit of money for that. So questions on part B, basic counts. I know this is a lot, and I know I'm running through it, but I don't want to be here for 2 hours, and I'm sure that you don't want to be either. Okay. Weighted counts. So weighted counts is where we discussed the last time we talked about this form. The first part of weighted counts is disadvantage, which is your free and reduced lunch rate. So basically the state has said, and I'm not sure if I shared this the last time, that it's impossible for us to collect free and reduced applications from secondary students. So what the state does is it looks at, or it gets the free and reduced lunch application, the free and reduced rate for pre-K to 8 students, and it uses that for all of the students throughout. So you can see, according to this, our lunch rate last year was for pre-K to 8 is 0.4201. So it uses that as a weighted average. The number of students who received free and reduced lunch, you can see in the 4-year-olds, the K to 8, the 9 through 12. The EPS weight is 0.15, and you can. It also pulls in the tuition rate for that one, and you can see where it throws in money for those 3 lines. Questions about lines 1, 2, and 3 in section C. Section in C, lines 4, 5, and 6 deals with our English language learners, our ELL students. So when we count things, we also count ELL students. You can see from lines 4, 5, and 6 that we had 0 4-year-old pre-K ELL students. We had 6 K to 8 ELL students, and we had 3 9 to 12 students. The EPS weight for those students is 0.70, and then you multiply that by the tuition rate on page 1, and you will see the weighted allocation over to the right again. Targeted funds. Subsection D, targeted funds. So lines 1, 2, and 3 for students' assessments. So basically, they give you an amount, a targeted amount that you were supposed to use for the assessment of students. And you will see that the EPS targeted amount per student is $52. That's over in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, depending upon what you call a column. And it takes those number of students, multiplies, and then again, it throws it in the bucket to the far right. Technology resources. So this deals with lines 4, 5, and 6. They give an amount based on the number of students you have for technology. You'll notice the rate for technology for pre-K to 8 is $113 a student, and it's $340 for 9-12. So it's slightly different, but it takes the averages from above and again, throws it into our coffer. 4-year-old students. So the state throws in additional monies for pre-K or 4-year-old students and K to 12 students for things like K to 2, sorry, for things like smaller class sizes. So it calls that a targeted fund. It adds those students and multiplies it by the EPS rate again on page 1, and you can see the funds that they give in that section. The state has also in recent years added additional funds for disadvantage, again for your free and reduced. That deals with lines 9, 10, and 11, and it's just additional monies for our disadvantaged students. And you will see that there's a targeted rate of 0.05 for those additional funds. The state, for some school districts, section E, before I move on to E, questions about subsection D?
Yeah. So the EPS weights are taking the EPS per pupil rate and adding a percentage on, so that 10 is like you get 110% of the amount.
Exactly, it's giving a weighted amount to it, exactly. You got it. Other questions about subsection D? Okay. Section E, or subsection E rather. Isolated small school adjustments. The state provides an adjustment for those isolated school districts. So if you were operating school on Vinyl Haven, there are certain challenges with operating a school on an island, and the state makes adjustments for those types of school districts. And you'll see that they break it out from pre-K to 8 and 9 to 12. Some school districts only operate pre-K to 8, and I've never seen a school district that's just operated 9 to 12. Have you?
Well, yes, the 5-town CSD in Camden Rockport,
Yep.
that's just a 9 through 12.
Yep.
So they do exist occasionally.
So at the bottom of this page, you will see if you add the column to the right, this is the total of everything that the state has thrown into our coffer. So we're looking at 16,234,355, and we're not done yet. So in the next section, section 3, the state gives us other subsidizable costs. So gifted and talented is the first of the other subsidizable costs. So basically they're looking at our expenditures from 1920 and giving us an inflation adjustment on that. So our base year expenditures, so obviously in 1920, we spent 196,000, give or take. They're giving us an inflation adjustment, and they're throwing that into the same kitty. You'll see where it adds both kitties together. Special education, the EPS allocation. So the special ed EPS allocation, if we were to sit and discuss it, we would probably be here all night, but I'm just going to brush over it with you. It's either a 5 or 6 part allocation, and it's it's honestly, it's quite complicated, but it starts based on the prevalence rate. So the state has set a prevalence rate of 15% across the state. So if your identified special ed students throughout the district are more than 15% of your population, you get this amount of money, but if it's less than 15%, then you get another amount of money. So if you're less, I shouldn't say it like that. Let me rephrase that. So for the first 15% of your prevalence rate, you get a weighted rate. So the state creates a weighted rate based on the elementary and the secondary. It actually figures out how many students you have, and then it comes up with a blended rate. So there's one special ed rate based on your district, based on your ED 279. It then takes that rate and uses a 1.5 multiplier for the first 15% of your identified special ed students. The number of special ed students over 15%, monies are tossed into the kitty at 0.38%. So it's much less than the 1.5%. So if you're able, I shouldn't say that. So that's basically how it starts off the calculation. It then looks at a lot of things like your high end district students. It also looks at your out of district placements. It looks at your expenditures from 2 years ago, and it looks at your revenue. And at the end of the day, this long calculation, it gives you the highest of their calculation or of your expenditures. So it's a very, if the committee wants to look at special ed on another day, it would be a meeting in itself. We could certainly do so, but it's actually quite complicated. So that is how they determine how much they throw into the coffers for special ed. I've just given you a very, very brief overview. So for this year,
Andrea, excuse me.
sorry, Jim.
I have one quick question. On line 3, it says
Yep.
out of high cost out of district allocation, and it says $13,000. What is that covering?
So the state every year sets a rate for the cost it will cover over and above for out of district placements. So I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So it's either 3 or 4 times the tuition rate of an in-district student. And if that student costs more than that, the state will cover the difference. So this is the total of all of those kids that were over what the base rate of what the state would cover.
Because when our out of district placements cost us $100,000+.
It is only a small percentage. It's
Okay.
just those students who are exceeding what the state allows for their calculation.
Okay.
But yes, we spend a lot more in out of district placements than what is shown on this sheet.
And is it correct, Andrea, that they will reimburse in that line, they'll provide a reimbursement only if it was an unanticipated expense? So if you built your budget and the student was in the district and you should have known to budget for an out-of-district placement, they won't reimburse you. But if they moved in after you built the budget, you hadn't planned on it, that's when this would kick in? Is that accurate?
No, so the state sometimes covers special ed out-of-district placements if the student if we didn't know about them, and it's based on your budget size and your special ed size. So we would never, I have never seen a year that we would qualify for the state to cover our for special ed, but for some school districts, especially smaller school districts where a tuition placement would be such a large, I mean, we're talking about I mean, we've talked about tuition for out-of-district placements. We're talking about them sometimes costing 100,000. So if you're a small school district of 600 kids, you know, that tuition, that out-of-district placement may be a very large percentage of your budget. That the percentage that the state has set for that, I don't see us qualifying for the state covering for unanticipated special ed out-of-district costs because our budget is so large. But you're
In comparison.
very true, in comparison.
It's a big number.
So the next line is transportation. So the state does, again, the state has its own calculation for transportation, and it's one of two things. So they have a calculation based on the miles of roads in your school district, and they compare that to your expenditures from 2 years ago, and you get the lesser of those two. And for us, it's always our expenditures. The lesser of the two has always been our expenditures. So I view it as seeing that we're pretty thrifty as far as transportation goes, because I have never been here a year where we get what the state calculation is based on roads. But that's how they do the calculation. And again, they have separate sheets for that. And the approved allocation purchase year, that's a new thing and it doesn't apply to us, number 5. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, approved bus allocation. So if you're purchasing a school bus, it helps if I can read, if I can see. So approved bus allocation. So those people who buy their school buses, which we don't, we lease our buses. We lease our buses with Sierra Buses, and we actually employ our drivers, but there are other districts that own and service their own buses, and they have to put in for school bus purchases. So this is where the state would reimburse those if they were approved through the state school bus purchase program. Like I said, we don't buy our buses, and we have never since I've been here. So if you add all of the costs in section 3, you get 5,256,000. Sorry, my arms aren't long enough. My contacts are getting funky. Section 4, section 3, subsection B, teacher retirement amount. So those of you who are familiar with main PERS, which is the state retirement system, the district, if the district contributes a portion of the retirement costs for those employees who are covered by main PERS, not all of our employees are covered by main PERS. It's basically teachers, ed techs 2s and 3s, and administrators. And in lieu of paying into Social Security, the district pays for main PERS for these individuals. It's at a rate similar, if not exactly, to what the district would pay for Social Security. But the state is kicked in money in this calculation for some of those costs. So, and that is what they figured. So the normalized costs are those costs. So they have normalized costs, and then they have costs when an employee retires, which includes health insurance, and this does not include that, or anyway. So that is what they're kicking in. So if you add the bottom of page 2 in the section that we just added and the teacher retirement amount, you will see a total adjusted operating allocation of $21,996,000 and change. In addition to that, in section C, you will see on line 3, where we are being approved for lease reimbursement for the old portable, and I shouldn't say old portable, it's probably 3 years old. So if you don't own your portable, and we do not own that portable, the state will reimburse you up to 5 years for some of the costs. And that is what they are throwing into our AD 279 for part of those lease purchase. Questions about any of that? So the grand total is 22,039,000 and change. And this is the amount that the state, in their eyes, thinks that we should be able to operate. But this is not our entire budget. This is just how the state bases their funding formula. So with that,
And many of those figures have not been adjusted in years, correct? Which is a basis, and there has been a strong feeling of many educators, business managers, that the current EPS system definitely underfunds education. It does not fund for all of the costs necessary to operate a school district.
so the state enacted EPS about the time that folks started talking about the state funding 55% of education. So as a way of mitigating, or the state's problem was 55% of what, and the fear was 55% of whatever a school district spent. Well, there would be no containment on that cost. So this formula is in response to the 55% of. There has been at least one study that I know of, the PICA study, that looking at the funding mechanisms and the way things work in this formula. And they made recommendations to the state, and basically the state couldn't afford to fund the recommendations made by PICA. I think it spent a lot of money on this. They brought somebody in who reviewed all the elements of the ED 279, and they understood that there were problems with it, but at the end of the day, they just did not have the funds as recommended by PICA, so away went the PICA study. The state makes small adjustments to the components every year to try to fix certain things, like the additional targeted weights for disadvantaged students, or it may play with the rates. Like on page 1, we talked about the student to staff ratio to try to help. And it may try to do that this year because of all of the learning challenges we had last year. We will see what those staff ratios are, but they do make small adjustments, but none to the effect that Pat and I were talking about that were being recommended with the PICA's study. So this is what the state says at the bottom of page 3 is what the state says that based on our student size that we should be able to operate our budget for. But there are very few districts, most can't. So the next page is section 6. Did I miss a page? No. So the state takes on section 6 is the calculation of required total contribution. This is where the state figures out how much each of our communities will owe. So in this section, section A, you'll see for all 4 of our towns listed: Gardner, Pittston, Randolph, West Gardner. You see our student counts, our subsidizable student counts, the resident students in each of those towns, and the percentage of those students in each of the towns. And if you were to basically the state does this calculation for minimum receivers, people who, so if you were to break out the cost to each of our entire budget to each of the 4 towns, I shouldn't say the budget, the allocation that it calculated previously to each of our 4 towns, this is what it says the 4 towns would owe, but we are not a minimum receiver, so section A really does not apply to us. None of our towns pay as much as what's shown in section A. In section B, however, that does apply to us. And it's in section B, the state looks at the average 3-year valuation of the towns. So it doesn't look at what the towns say that their property is worth. It looks at what the state says the property is worth. And the reason that it looks at the state is because the state tries to be the great equalizer. Not all of the towns in the state of Maine do property taxes and do evaluate properties the same way. So the state has its own calculation of the values of each of our communities. So for the purpose of the ED 279, this is what they use. So the 3-year valuation of our 4 communities, you see, and the total of them is not, the total of it is $950 million. The mill expectation that you see in the next column over, essentially, the state figures out how much money it has and then adjusts the mill rate to reflect the money it has to apply to education or to be able to fund all of these ED 279s for every district in the state. So if the state gets more money, you'll see the mill rate drop. If the state has to do a cut to its funding, you'll see the mill rate increase. It works much the same way as the local mill rate in the cities and the town work. Questions? I see it. It's looking at me with a furrowed brow. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you, so the way the state figures out how much each of these towns owes or is required to contribute, it uses the 3-year valuation. It multiplies that by the mill rate, and you'll see over to the right, which is the total municipal allocation distribution. Basically, it's the amount that each of the 4 towns needs to pay in order for the district to get state subsidy. So you'll hear me call it the local allocation, the foundation allocation. It's basically the base piece. Okay.
So the mill expectation is the estimate of the rate of property tax that they're expecting the municipalities to kick in?
So the mill expectation is a rate set by the state that would allow it to fund all of the ED 279s for school districts in the state. So the state says, this is how much money we have to fund education or for this portion of education. And then it looks at these ED 279s for every single district. And it says, okay, so based on last year's mill rate, what would we need? Well, geez, we need more than what we have. Now we need to adjust. It requires more than what we have for funding. So now they need to play with the mill expectation to bring that mill rate. And that's actually, if they don't have enough money, they'd actually raise the mill rate for the local so that the locals contribute more and the state would contribute less. Does that make sense? Yeah. So they basically use that as their, I don't even know what to call it.
So this expected mill rate is, yeah, it's kind of like the great equalizer, as you said, but the 7.9 is the mill rate across the state.
It is the rate that the state is using for the calculation of this version of the ED 279.
And that is the same across the state, whereas the mill rate in your community is different.
Absolutely.
And that's a great
Yes.
clarifier.
Yes.
So that
Yep.
it makes the, okay.
So the mill rate in each of our 4 towns is vastly different. The mill rate in West Gardner, I would love to live in West Gardner. I think their
I
mill
know,
rate
right?
is somewhere between 13 and 15, the mill rate in Gardner. And these are for your local taxes. So the mill rate in West Gardner is when you pay your taxes to the town of West Gardner. The mill rate in Gardner, again, ranges between,
It's at like
I would say
22.
between 22 and 26. I don't know specifically where it is, and it's different for all of our 4 communities. And the way the mill rate is calculated in each of our. I would say between 22 and 26. I don't know specifically where it is, and it's different.
Hold on, I'm sorry.
It's okay. And the way the mill rate is calculated in each of our. God, I sound like that. So
Evidently.
the way.
Sorry about that. Good grief. Hang on. Let me shut this thing down.
It's okay. And the way the mill rate is calculated in each of our. God, I sound like that.
I cannot get this thing to go off.
Hey, Terry, you want to help? Could you help Jim with this?
You got it to me.
Maybe I have, I don't know. It's off now.
Yeah.
I still got power, but sorry about that.
You are fine, you're absolutely fine. So I'm gonna give you a simplified overview of how
Trying to go over
the,
something. I'm gonna leave it off.
so the simplified.
It's on.
So the way,
Sorry about that.
so the simplified overview of how.
Want to borrow my ballot?
Hold on. There.
So the simplified overview of how your towns calculate, or the cities calculate the mill rate is they add up all their bills. And then they look to see how much they can generate based on property taxes. So then they play with the mill rate to be able to generate enough revenue to cover their expenses. It's the same thing that it's the same thing that I just described to you that the state is doing. They jimmy with, they add up the school districts, the bill from the school district, they add up the bills from all of their town, all of their departments. And said this is how much we need to raise for next year. And then they look at how much everybody's property is worth. Well, we're only going to raise this much based on the mill rate this year. Well, we need to increase the mill rate. Oops, we're raising more than what we need. We should probably decrease the mill rate. So that is how they come up with the mill rate as well. So that's a simplified version. I'm sure a lot more goes into it on their end, but that's basically how it works. So for the 4 communities that we discussed for last year, the foundation allocation, which is the amount that our communities are required to raise by the state based on the 7.5 mill rate, was 7 million and change. I want to guess, but I don't want everyone to know how bad my eyesight is.
7,500.
There you go.
7 million.
$7,505,000.
Thank you. So on the following page, what the state does is it takes that total allocation figure that we added from pages 2, 3, 4, and it subtracts out the local contribution, and what is left is the state contribution. So at the bottom of it, you'll see based on the local allocation, the local share is 34.05, and based on the state share, it's 65.95. But in order to fund our entire budget, we need additional monies, as most districts do. So you will see those shares shift when we do the actual budget. This is just the funding mechanism. And then on the last page, you will see where they will break our payments out over the year. We receive our payments monthly, so just like a paycheck. And the only other thing that I would really say is that the only thing that will change this is our seed money. So throughout the year, our special purpose private school students who are billed out to Medicare, the districts. So for those of you who know anything about Medicare or main care, there's 2 components. There's a federal component and there's a state component. So for those main care students that we have who out of district private schools are able to bill Medicare for them, hang with me, I'll get through this. So those students who are main care or Medicare eligible, the special purpose schools bills the state kicks in, the state doesn't kick in, the state provides or passes along the federal share. The state share, however, comes out of our budget. So it's like I want to say it's a 1/3, 2/3. So 2/3 is covered by feds, a third's covered by us, but that rate changes. So whenever these special purpose out of district placement schools bill, we see our subsidy reduced, and we see that quarterly. So Sarah Bolduc-Ignasiak and I will look at, typically we get the bills for these 6 months later than what they occur. Sarah reviews all the students and the services that they're allowed. We add it up, we look to see if there are any problems, and we either sign off on it or we tell the state there are problems. This child doesn't belong to me, or this child is not supposed to have these services. We let the state know. By then, the state has already taken the money from our subsidy. But if it's their error, we get it back. But that is the only thing that affects these monthly payments. So in order for us to cushion these payments being subtracted or deducted from our subsidy, you will hear us talk about when we're doing our budget, budgeting for seed money, so that we're allowing or knowing that they're going to take money from us as we go along, and that it's covered for in our budget. And you'll hear me give the same kind of awkward explanation when we talk about it during budget, but that's what this is about. I know that was a lot of information, and I know I rushed through it. If you have questions privately, feel free to email me. I will share them with the rest of the committee, but I wanted you to have an overview. Once we receive our ED 279 for next year, I will give you a copy of it, just so that you know these are all available on the state website. The state, you can see any school communities ED 279 for any year. If you just Google ED 279 Maine, you will be able to just scroll through the versions of the ED 279. Sometimes we get 2 or 3 versions of an ED 279. Sometimes we get 1. Last year we received 2. This is the version that we did our budget with. If you remember, for those of us who were here last year, the state was doing adjustments to their biannual budget right up through the end of June. So in July, after we passed our budget, we actually received a new ED 279 for the budget that we had already passed. So when that happened, we ended up getting some additional funds. As you remember, some of those funds were returned to the 4 communities. The board decided that it was going to use monies for that, and then use the remainder for capital improvements and then whatnot. So that's what we chose to do this year. Questions? Wow, either everybody's glazed over, or I did such a fine job that nobody has any questions.
It was the latter.
I don't think so.
But I find this extremely helpful,
Yeah.
Andrea.
It
I
really
mean,
is
I've been through
helpful.
it multiple times and I still get questions and I don't remember because it just is so complicated. So it's nice to have the summary.
Thank
I
you
learn
for
something
making me
new
do
every
it
time.
before Christmas. It's painful.
Well, I learned something new every time.
Good,
Thank you
I'm
so much
glad.
for doing that. Appreciate it. Next, update on facility projects.
Generally, we have Gabe Dostie come to your December Finance Committee meeting. This year, he's had so much going on with the modular units and transportation and everything else that he is not prepared to come to this particular meeting. He will be at your January Finance Committee meeting with a 5-year capital improvement plan that he will go through with you. He is currently working on the development of that plan. He's waiting for some estimates to come in. I can tell you that the big projects that we'll be looking at for this next year is really connected to roof repair. This roof, he's learned, needs to be replaced. This roof is in bad shape. Pittston is another big project. That roof needs to be done. And the middle school, I think there's one at the middle school. The other projects that we'll have to talk about and consider, and it's one that you've heard repeatedly. When do we replace the gym floor at Riverview? When do we replace the gym floor at LER? And what about the asbestos tile in the cafeteria at the high school? It's starting to come up in certain places. And so, of course, when are we going to do that? Gabe has put that out to us for a couple of years in a row, and we continue to put it off because we haven't had the money. But those are, I think, off the top of my head, those are probably the biggest projects that we anticipate. As a reminder, we already were able to use a lot of the ESSER and federal COVID money to help address a number of our facility issues, to address air circulation by getting some new windows in so that the windows could open, we could have fresh air. We took care of our HVAC system. We're going to be able to put a lot of money into pavement because we just have so much more traffic. We already knew that we needed to have some of our pavement replaced, but now we've put some money for that. So that saves us from having to build it into the budget. So anyways, that's just a brief overview of what we expect Gabe to present to you next month. Okay,
Great.
Why, this is kind of an old question, but when you were talking about the old modular buildings being rented, do we own these new ones?
yes.
Oh.
We own the new ones. We were able to use the federal dollars because we needed additional space. It was approved for us to actually purchase the 2 additional classrooms that are attached to the Pittston Randolph modular unit, and the entire unit over at the Helen Thompson School, which includes 4 classrooms.
I would guess that's cheaper than renting them. I don't know.
Well,
In the long run.
cheaper, maybe in the long run. Unfortunately, given the market at the time when we purchased that, the construction supplies were through the roof. Transportation, that those units cost twice what we spent on the Pittston Randolph, the first modular unit. It was double. Yeah, it was very expensive.
The pandemic has thrown our
Everything.
supply chain, everything went out of
Right.
whack.
I know my son-in-law's in construction.
It's crazy.
Jim?
Are we still on a list to someday have a Pittston Randolph school?
The last time that the application opened, we did submit. We were still quite low on that list. Now that we have modular units, that might help move us up that list. I'm not sure when that construction application will open again, but once we hear, I will certainly bring that back to the board to see if the board would wish to submit an application again in the future.
Yes, Jim.
The modulars that we have at Pittston Randolph right now, they're in their 3rd year, as I recall, right now. And we have 2 more that we are subsidized by the state for the leases. Going forward, what are you envisioning as the plan? Are we looking at purchasing those with a loan, paying out the lease? I mean, it doesn't lend itself well to handing back at the end of the lease time part of the units and keeping 2 units.
So it's a year-by-year lease.
Yeah.
I really think it goes hand in hand with the conversation that Pat was just talking about. When the next time that the state opens its school construction projects, what is the plan for the I was going to call it the TC Hamlin School, bite my tongue, for the Pittston Randolph Consolidated School? I guess it depends on the vision. The cost of our new modulars we would have to be there a very long time to pay anywhere near what we've paid for the other two sets of modulars. So I think it depends on what the vision of the board
I'm
is.
not quite understanding what you're saying. Maybe it's just a little
No.
dance on it, but are we? We've already paid for the ones that we got through the subsidization from the COVID money.
Correct.
Well, what I'm looking at is, at some point in time, the state will stop subsidizing these lease payments. Right now, it makes no sense to pay them off, but there's going to be X number of dollars left at the end of this lease term. What are we envisioning doing with those at the end? Not the 10-year. I think we have a 10-year lease, or
No, it's
I
a,
know it's a year to year, but the envision wasn't supposed to pay out in 10 or?
it's an open-ended lease. The state will reimburse us for 5 of those years. The
Right.
district can continue to pay. I think we pay $50,000 a year. So basically, it would be in our budget without the subsidizable portion from the
Right.
state. For however long the board wishes to continue, if the board wants to at some point purchase. the
What is going to
lease.
be do we have an idea what the purchase price would be?
We
Have
have,
they given us a number?
we have
Because I
never,
used to do a lot of leasing when I sold tractors.
we have never asked for a purchase price. We've always looked at it year by year. But now that we have more classrooms attached, maybe that's a conversation, but based on the current cost of modulars, I don't know that now is the best time to ask for the purchase price. We may want to wait at the end of,
No,
when the state stops subsidizing us, to see if the cost of modulars will go down. Maybe it's so that we only need them for another 5 years. Maybe they'll be,
So I think that's a conversation, Jim, that the board is going to have.
okay.
And make a decision on what you want to do. Do you want to continue leasing, or do you want us to really explore purchasing that item? We did explore purchasing, if you recall, we explored purchasing. I don't remember
The
the
reason why.
number. I don't remember the number, but the question was, can we use COVID money to just purchase it outright, since we were attaching 2 additional classrooms to it? And the answer was no. It was something that was already here. We couldn't then use
Right.
COVID money
I
because it was
understand
already
that.
in place. But so we did explore it. I just don't remember what numbers we were provided at that time.
I've been out of the
But-
leasing business for a very long time, but it's used to be that there was usually, you had to have a minimum of a 10% value at the end of a lease. You couldn't, the federal government, for tax purposes, did not want you to lease something and have a 50% value at the end of the lease if there was going to be a purchase. And I don't know, I would like to know how it was leased. It makes a difference to how we would proceed. So I would have expected to see some kind of a value built into the back end of the lease. In other words, and maybe we're just a true lease where it's
it's a
just,
true lease. So the minute we stop paying on it, they come and they pull their truck up and they just pull it away. It's not a lease. It's not like our truck where we do a lease to purchase. It's just a pure lease. And I'm trying to remember back when we closed Hamlin, what the conversation was, why we chose to go with lease payments as opposed to a lease purchase. Do you remember the conversation? I would need to go
Because
back and look at my notes.
as I remember, the value on those units was in the neighborhood of $400,000 or something like that at that time. The units that were, that's if we were to go out and have purchased them. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 600,000, but right now we're paying between 50 and 60,000, somewhere's in that ballpark. And if it is just straight
It's a straight,
lease,
that is what it
then
is.
I personally think we should have looked at it a little differently. Most of the leases that I've seen over the years, you could have it both ways. You could hand it back, or you could have a buyout built into the back end of the lease. And it usually didn't make a whole lot of difference.
I think it was the decision of the committee at that, there was a huge committee when we.
I wasn't on the board then.
Sorry, I can't remember who, I would need to go back and look at our notes to see why we
I'd
decided
like to
what we
understand the
decided.
reasoning
I will
why
see
we
if I
didn't
can find that.
get a back end value on that, because the way we look, and you're absolutely correct, if we were to go right now, they could pick those up and resell them for every dime that that we would have. We could have bought them for, and they'd be able to sell them for exactly the same amount after 5 years for what we would have paid for them brand spanking new.
Agreed, but on the other hand, look at the modulars at the high school that we can't pay anybody to get rid of.
Yeah.
So I understand, I understand
30 years
what
from
you're
now, I agree
saying.
with you, but that's a 30-year-old modular versus a 5-year-old modular. There's a difference in those things.
While we continue to pay for them,
Yeah.
that no one is going to back up and
No.
take them from us.
No, I realize that, but
Yeah.
I don't want to pay for them for 20 years.
Right. Yep.
It makes no sense to do it for 20 years. It is marginally reasonable to pay for them for 10.
Yep.
Past that, it goes into that part of the area that we are spending money that we should not be spending,
So the
my
just,
thinking.
so the district for the past, I don't know how many cycles, at least 5, has submitted applications, construction applications for a combined school.
That's
And
a,
every time every time the construction cycle opens, we have submitted applications for Pittston and Hamlin. The only thing that I can think of is that we would continue moving forward. I don't remember a year that it's open that we haven't submitted, so maybe that was the thought. I will have to go back and look at my notes, but it was a decision made by committee how we would move forward.
But given that the state subsidy is going to be coming to a close, I think it would be a good idea for us, for the committee, to take a look. We can certainly explore what the options are,
Yeah.
and what the costs would be, and to do it sooner than waiting until all 5 years are up. But I agree, I think we have to be really careful. I agree with Andrea that the costs right now for construction, I think they're coming down, but this may not be the ideal time to pull the trigger, but at least to know what our options are. Yeah, I agree that is something that we should be doing, Jim.
With the lease, we might discover 5 to 10 years down the road, the amount of deferred maintenance on a quickly built modular might detract from the amount of value that we'd get from purchasing it as opposed to giving it back.
These are actually quite nice
Yeah.
units.
They're
They're
quickly
they're
built.
well built. You would not build a better stick-built building if you built it on site than what those buildings are right there. The fact that they were brought in on a carriage and set in place does nothing to take away from the quality of the construction. I personally think, I was not in favor of the modulars. I had this vision of a tin can on wheels. And these units are excellent construction. They've got quality equipment in them. The least, the only thing I don't know about, it would be the actual floor joists and those sort of things, but the rest of it, it's 2x6 sidewalls and interior construction is solid.
That's awesome.
No,
I've not
they're well
been able
built.
to them.
So, anyways, thank you.
But now that we have those modulars there, maybe it is a different discussion about school construction in this construction cycle. Whether or not we are going to submit, or whether the board wishes to submit an application for a single school, or whether, who knows? Just thoughts.
I think one of the things that we were considering back 3 years ago was what the trend might be within the district as far as our student population, because it is continuing to go down. So as we think about what to do.
And from time to time, we talk about a consolidated elementary school. I mean, I don't think the board has ever, well, no, but there would be a lot of benefits
Right.
for a consolidated elementary school. There's a lot of duplication of services in each of our schools with,
You're not
Yeah.
selling me on it, so don't.
No, but it is something we ought to, that we need to responsibly continue to talk about just because of the duplication of resources and what we can provide for our students across the district.
I think that I think we might be able to provide a lot more, but that's my opinion. So, anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole.
Well, no, but I think that was actually part of the conversation then as well. So I think, again, it's just gonna keep creeping along as we,
Part of a bigger discussion.
right, part of a much bigger discussion. So, future agenda items?
We will have Gabe next month. He will be here. And then we will be in the throes of budget development.
Perfect. We will adjourn then. Thank you all so much for
Thank you.
adjourning at 6:49.